They called it the longest day. But what if I told you most of what you know about D-Day is a lie? The beach landings? Just one layer of the blood-soaked horror. The real terror was the chaos behind the curtain. Here's the secret nobody told you in school. D-Day was not the clean, coordinated Allied miracle it's so often portrayed as. It was madness. Screaming boys drowning under the weight of their own gear. Flamethrowers incinerating men alive. Strategic blunders that cost thousands of lives in minutes. And an unfiltered truth that was censored, buried, and forgotten until now. Why did a Nazi general ignore the one order that could have changed history? Why did elite Allied paratroopers drop into the wrong country? And why were thousands of American soldiers sent to die on purpose? Welcome to the side of D-Day they never wanted you to see. Because once you step onto this beach, there's no going back. The Allied invasion of Normandy wasn't just a military operation. It was a gamble with human lives, a brutal, last-ditch roll of the dice that would determine whether Europe was liberated or swallowed whole by Hitler's war machine.
June 6, 1944. The code name was Operation Overlord, and on the surface, it looked like the perfect storm. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 156,000 troops, the largest amphibious invasion in history. But behind the grand numbers, there was confusion, panic, betrayal, and a cold, ruthless calculus by Allied command, one that saw young men as pawns on a bloody chessboard.
Take the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne. They were told they'd be the first boots on French soil, saviors in the night. But what happened was anything but heroic. Thick clouds and relentless flak threw their drop zones into chaos. Pilots panicked. Planes veered wildly. Troopers were dropped miles off target or into flooded marshes where dozens drowned before they could even fire a shot. Some never found their units. Others landed right on top of German machine gun nests. And then there were the crickets. Tiny clickers handed out to paratroopers to help them find each other in the dark. But guess what? Germans figured them out. Within hours, that clicking sound became a death sentence. You click, they shoot. Still think this was a flawless Allied victory? But the worst was yet to come, and it came with the rising sun on the beaches. Let's talk Omaha Beach. The name is legendary. The truth, far darker. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave of American soldiers hit the water. But not the beach, the water, because their landing crafts stopped too far out. With 70 to 90 pounds of gear strapped to their backs, many simply sank. They didn't even get to fight. They just disappeared. And those who made it to shore, they found themselves trapped in a meat grinder. The German defenders were dug in deep. Concrete bunkers, machine guns, mortars, anti-tank guns. The terrain favored them, the tides favored them, even the weather favored them, and somehow Allied intelligence hadn't seen it coming. Some units suffered up to 90% casualties within minutes, bodies stacked on the sand, blood in the surf. Radios failed, commanders were killed. The plan was collapsing in real time. But here's where the truth turned sinister. High command knew Omaha could be a disaster. In fact, they accepted it. Because Omaha wasn't just about taking ground. It was about diverting fire. British and Canadian forces landing at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches were depending on the chaos at Omaha to draw German attention away. In other words, American soldiers were bait. Still think this was a noble crusade? Now let's rewind, because before the landings, there was the deception, Operation Bodyguard, a massive misinformation campaign to fool Hitler into thinking the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais, not Normandy.
Sounds clever, right? And it was. Fake radio chatter, dummy tanks, even a dead body dressed as a British officer dropped in Spain with phony invasion plans in his pocket. But here's the twist. It worked too well. By the time the Allies hit Normandy, Hitler was convinced it was a diversion. He refused to release the panzer divisions stationed at Calais, elite armored units that could have crushed the beachhead. He waited for days for an invasion that never came. Why? Because Hitler believed his astrologers more than his generals. Because his inner circle was too afraid to contradict him. Because Nazi command was paralyzed by lies of its own making. And while they hesitated, the Allies bled, crawled, and clawed their way inland. But let's not romanticize this. Because for every hero with a rifle, there was a terrified kid with no combat experience. For every successful landing, there were botched missions and friendly fire, like the naval bombardment. It was supposed to soften the German defenses, but most shells overshot their targets or landed inland. The bunkers at Omaha still fully operational when the first soldiers arrived. And those tanks? The so-called swimming Shermans? Many sank before reaching shore. Bad design, rough seas, poor timing. It was a disaster. Commanders later called it acceptable losses, but to the men in those tanks, there was nothing acceptable about drowning inside a steel coffin. Now here's something they really don't teach in schools. Do you know what some Allied troops did after finally taking German positions? They executed prisoners. No trials, no mercy, just rage, retaliation, revenge. War crimes? Absolutely. Justified. Some would say yes, others no. But one thing's for sure, D-Day wasn't black and white, it was red, blood red. And here's where it gets even darker. The French civilians. You think they all welcomed the Allies with flowers and flags? Think again. The town of Carentan was bombed into rubble. Caen burned for days. Allied air raids killed tens of thousands of French civilians in the name of liberation. By the end of the campaign, some locals weren't thanking the Americans, they were cursing them. This wasn't just a fight for freedom. It was a demolition of anything that stood in the way. And yet, somehow, they pulled it off. By midnight, on June 6th, the Allies had secured the beaches, barely. The cost? Over 10,000 casualties. And that was just day one. But they had a foothold, a crack in the Atlantic Wall, the beginning of the end for Hitler. Still, it wasn't destiny. It was chaos, brutality, luck, mistakes, and a level of human suffering we rarely confront. Because D-Day, in its raw, uncensored form, wasn't a clean page in a history book. It was a nightmare made real. And what happened after D-Day? That's where things get even more disturbing. The retaliation, the scorched earth policies, the secret Nazi escape routes, the hidden bunkers, the truth behind the liberation of Europe. You've seen the beaches, but have you seen what was waiting inland? If you want to see how Hitler's final gamble and the Allied response turned into something even darker than D-Day itself, hit subscribe now. Chapter 2 is where everything changes. The Allies had landed. The beaches were secured, barely. But what came next was far more brutal, far less glorified, and deeply buried beneath the mythology of June 6th. Because the bloodbath didn't end with D-Day. In fact, that was just the beginning of the nightmare. The real horror waited inland. Picture this: bombed-out Norman villages still smoldering. Civilians digging their children out of rubble, paratroopers with 1,000-yard stares, marching through orchards soaked in rain and death. The push into France wasn't liberation, it was annihilation. And the Germans, they didn't retreat. They dug in,
fought street to street, house to house. Church steeples became sniper nests. Fields were laced with hidden mines. Every hedgerow, every pasture became a kill zone. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a slaughterhouse with no exits. The region was called the bocage, tight, twisted terrain of sunken roads and thick, tangled hedgerows. It was a natural fortress, and German troops knew it like the back of their hand.
The Allies? Not so much. They expected open fields, blitzkrieg-style advances. Instead, they found themselves in a maze of green hell, where tanks couldn't turn, infantry couldn't see, and every leaf could hide a rifle barrel. American GIs called it the Green Wall of Death, and it swallowed them whole. Every advance cost blood. Every mistake left a platoon dead. You could walk 10 steps and step on a mine, or worse, trip a wire and bring down an artillery barrage so precise it felt like the Germans were reading their minds. In reality, they kind of were, because Hitler's last advantage was still in play, the SS Panzer divisions. And when they finally arrived, Normandy turned into something out of Dante's Inferno. Let's talk about the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, made up of teenage fanatics trained from birth to kill without hesitation. They were young, angry, and indoctrinated to the bone. When they met the Canadians near Caen, they didn't just fight, they massacred. Wounded soldiers executed in ditches, medics shot while trying to save lives, civilians hung from trees as warning.
One SS officer was overheard saying, "We take no prisoners, not here, not now." The Canadians responded in kind. Captured Germans were shot point blank. Some burned alive inside tanks. It wasn't war, it was revenge. Ugly, feral, human revenge. Still think the good guys kept their hands clean?
Meanwhile, Allied bombers were pounding German strongholds from the sky. But they weren't just hitting German troops, they were also hitting French towns, French schools, French hospitals. Caen was turned into a charred ruin. Saint-Lô was flattened. Le Havre, Rouen, Lisieux obliterated. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed by Allied bombs. Some estimates go as high as 70,000 by the time France was liberated. And here's the twisted part. Eisenhower and Churchill knew it was happening. They accepted the collateral damage. They called it strategic necessity, a cold phrase that meant children were turned to ash for the price of progress. Still feel heroic? Now imagine you're a French farmer. One day, the Germans occupy your village. The next, the Allies bomb it. Your livestock's dead. Your home is rubble. Your wife's body is under the staircase. And you're told to be grateful? Some civilians turned bitter. Some turned vengeful. And some turned collaborators. Yes, even after D-Day, Nazi collaborators still roamed the countryside. Some gave away Allied troop positions. Others snitched on Jewish neighbors or downed pilots. And when the Allies finally pushed deeper into France, the retribution began. Public shavings, beatings, executions. Women accused of sleeping with German officers had their heads shaved in the town square, paraded like animals. Some were stripped, tarred, even lynched. Liberation turned into humiliation. Justice turned into spectacle. But the darkest secrets were buried deeper still. Because as the Allies rolled eastward, what they discovered stunned even the most battle-hardened soldiers. Not just concentration camps. That came later. No, I'm talking about bunkers, vaults, and blueprints. Hidden beneath Nazi command posts were detailed maps, wire diagrams, and strange symbols that didn't make sense at the time. Some historians now believe they were early drafts, prototypes of atomic research, chemical agents, even psychological warfare tactics. There's evidence that the Nazis were working on ghost divisions, not real soldiers, but fake armies designed to psychologically paralyze enemy troops. Combined with early radio manipulation and disinformation, it was the embryo of something terrifying. Warfare that didn't just kill your body, but broke your mind.
And guess who picked it up after the war? That's right, the Allies, especially the Americans. Operation Paperclip. You've probably heard the name in passing.
But let me break it down for you. After the war, the US secretly brought over hundreds of Nazi scientists, engineers, and intelligence officers, gave them new identities, paid them, put them to work. The same minds behind Nazi rocketry and chemical weapons ended up working for NASA, DARPA, and the CIA. Why? Because the Cold War was beginning. And in this new war, morality was negotiable. Science wasn't judged by what it did, but who it served.
So yes, D-Day ended with a march to Berlin, but it also ended with a deal with the devil. Still think the war ended on the beaches? And what about Hitler? Contrary to popular myth, he wasn't caught off guard by D-Day. He'd been warned. The Atlantic Wall was one of the most fortified coastlines in history. But Hitler didn't believe the invasion would come at Normandy. Why? Because of astrology, because of a psychic, because of paranoia. Hitler kept entire panzer divisions waiting for orders that never came. He slept through the first critical hours of the invasion. Some say he was drugged, others say he was betrayed. Whatever the truth, his hesitation gave the Allies the crack they needed. But here's the thing no one wants to admit. If he had acted faster, if Rommel had gotten the tanks, if the Luftwaffe had scrambled sooner, we might be living in a very different world today. That's not praise, that's reality. So what's the legacy of D-Day? We're told it was the beginning of freedom, the turning point of World War II, a noble sacrifice. And in many ways it was. But it was also a slaughter, a deception, a calculated machine of death, driven by politics, missteps, and human desperation. It was the moment the world chose victory at any cost, and the cost was horrifying. Omaha, sword; Utah, Juno, gold. These weren't just code names, they were mass graves. So next time someone tells you the story of D-Day, ask them which version they mean. The heroic version or the truth? Because buried beneath the waves and behind the myths is a legacy that still echoes today in every act of state deception, every wartime moral compromise, every whisper that says, this time it's different, but it's never different.
Still watching? Then you're the kind of viewer we make this channel for. Tap subscribe now so you never miss the stories they tried to erase. And if this shook you, repost it. Share the truth. Because the ghosts of D-Day are still out there and they're waiting to be heard.